Policemen in dark uniforms stood tall, their badges gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. The judge, a man whose cold eyes revealed nothing but contempt, leaned forward with a smirk stretching across his face. He had already made up his mind. He had made up his mind long before this trial even began. The money had already exchanged hands. The outcome had been bought and sold before the accused even stepped foot in the courthouse. "You really thought you could walk in here and make a difference?" the judge sneered, adjusting his robe as he stared down at the defendant. "This is my courtroom. My city. And people like you don't get to dictate what happens here." The defendant stood in the middle of it all, a lone figure surrounded by a sea of power-hungry men who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience, an obstacle in their corrupt system. She had spent months uncovering the truth, pulling back the layers of lies that suffocated the city. But now, here she was, on trial, as if she were the criminal. As if she were the one in the wrong. The prosecutor, a man whose arrogance dripped from every word, slammed his hands down on the table. "This woman has obstructed justice. She has interfered with police matters, attempted to tamper with an ongoing investigation, and has shown a blatant disregard for the law. She is a danger to our system." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. The jury, carefully selected to ensure the right verdict, nodded along as if their minds had already been made up. "You should have stayed in your place," one of the officers muttered just loud enough for her to hear. She turned her head, locking eyes with the man who had arrested her under false charges, who had planted evidence against her, who had orchestrated this entire performance to silence her. "I don't know how you do it," she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning beneath her skin. "How you look at yourself in the mirror every day knowing you've sold your soul for a paycheck." The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's the problem with people like you. You think you're above the system. But the system was never made for you. It was made for us." The judge cleared his throat, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Enough. I don't need to hear another word. I've heard all I need to hear." He turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we all know what needs to be done. This trial was a mere formality. There was no deliberation. There was no pause." The judge lifted his gavel, looking directly at her with a slow, condescending smile. "Guilty." The word hit like a gunshot. She stood still, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. The murmurs in the courtroom turned to whispers, the smirks of the officers stretched wider. They had done it. They had erased her with a single word, buried her beneath the corruption they thrived on. But as the officers stepped forward to take her away, something shifted. She smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a bitter smile. A knowing smile. The kind of smile that made the officers pause. The kind of smile that sent a flicker of unease through the judge's expression. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she murmured, voice calm, composed. The judge frowned. "Excuse me. You think this is over," she said. "You think you've won." Her eyes burned with something different now, something colder, sharper. "But you just set something in motion that you can't stop." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. The judge tightened his grip on his gavel. Because something didn't feel right. Something felt off. She wasn't reacting like someone who had just been sentenced to years behind bars. She wasn't breaking down. She wasn't begging for mercy. She was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes when you know something nobody else does. And just like that, the room suddenly didn't feel as victorious as it had a moment ago. Because the truth. She wasn't just any woman. She was an FBI agent. And they had just walked straight into her trap. Now, the question is, how far does the corruption go? And what happens when the hunted becomes the hunter? Keep watching. The real story is just beginning. At Plow of Twist, we stand strongly against racism in all its forms. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of truth. No one should ever be judged or mistreated because of their skin color. This story is more than just entertainment, it's a wake-up call about corruption and racial injustice that still exists today. To our black viewers, you matter, your voice matters, and your fight for justice is valid. Stay strong, stay proud, and never stop standing up for what's right. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more thrilling content. Let's dive into it. The courtroom was a cold place, both in temperature and in spirit. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that clung to the walls, to the wooden benches, to the expressions of those seated in quiet anticipation. The ceiling-high windows let in a dim light, but it wasn't enough to brighten the room. It was the kind of place where verdicts weren't decided by truth, but by power. Where justice was a game, played by those who already knew they were going to win. Seated at the defendant's table was Jasmine Carter, a woman who knew exactly what this courtroom represented. She had seen its kind before. She had spent her entire career studying men like the one sitting in the judge's chair. Judge Harold Whitmore, a man whose record was spotless on paper, but whose hands were anything but clean. A man who had spent decades deciding the fate of those who stood before him, but had never once been held accountable for his own sins. The way he sat, with an arrogant ease, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't worried. He had already decided how this was going to end. Jasmine had spent her life fighting for justice. Raised in the heart of Atlanta, she had grown up seeing firsthand how the system failed people who looked like her. She had watched her father, a hard-working man who had never once broken the law, get pulled over one night and never come home. She had seen her mother fight for years to get even a shred of the truth, only to be met with closed doors and cold voices telling her to move on. Jasmine had decided then and there that she would never move on. That she would never sit back and accept injustice. That she would become the very thing this system feared most, a woman who knew its weaknesses. That decision had led her to the FBI, where she had spent years uncovering the corruption embedded in law enforcement, in government, in the very foundations of the justice system. She had worked cases that had exposed entire police departments for their unlawful arrests, their brutality, their cover-ups. She had seen men like Harold Whitmore get away with things that would destroy the lives of people without power. And now, she was here. Sitting in his courtroom. Not as an investigator. Not as an agent. But as the accused. The irony was suffocating. Across the room, the officers who had orchestrated this entire performance sat comfortably at the prosecutor's table, their uniforms pressed, their faces carefully composed. Officer Raymond Cross, the man who had personally placed the cuffs on her wrists, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had been part of this city's police force for over 15 years, climbing the ranks through methods that had nothing to do with merit. He wasn't just corrupt, he enjoyed being corrupt. He took pleasure in the power he held over people like her, in the way he could twist the truth into something unrecognizable and use it against anyone who threatened his authority. And Jasmine had threatened him. She had threatened all of them. Beside him sat Detective Brian Keller, a man whose loyalty to the badge extended only as far as the benefits it brought him. He wasn't as openly cruel as Cross, but he was just as dangerous. He was the kind of man who followed orders, no matter how dirty they were, because it was easier than questioning them. He was the kind of man who would watch an innocent person's life be destroyed and tell himself it wasn't his problem. That he was just doing his job. And that was exactly what he had done with Jasmine. They had built a case against her from nothing. Fabricated evidence. Twisted her words. Made it seem as though she had obstructed an investigation, when in reality, she had been the only one actually seeking justice. She had spent months collecting proof of police misconduct, of racial profiling, of officers planting evidence on innocent people to boost their arrest numbers. She had been close, so close, to blowing their entire operation wide open. And they had known it. That's why they had set this up. That's why they had made sure she ended up on trial instead of them. Jasmine knew how these things worked. She had seen it happen to others too many times to count. But knowing didn't make it any easier to sit here, in front of a jury that had been carefully chosen to see her as guilty before the trial even started. A jury that had been coached to believe she was dangerous. That she was reckless. That she was everything the prosecution said she was. She could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided looking at her directly, the way some of them sat stiffly, as if just being near her made them uncomfortable. She knew how this was going to end. But the thing about knowing? It meant she could plan. It meant she could be ready. Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe and cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the murmurs in the courtroom. He looked at Jasmine, but there was no real consideration in his gaze. Only amusement. The kind of amusement that came from a man who thought he had already won. "This court has heard enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had never been challenged. "It's time we put this matter to rest." A ripple of satisfaction passed through the officers at the prosecutor's table. Cross smirked. Keller leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. Jasmine remained still. Judge Whitmore lifted his gavel, his grip firm. "The defendant is," she smiled. It was a small smile. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. And for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed through the judge's expression. Because there was something in that smile that didn't belong. Something that said, "You think you've won, but you don't even realize you're playing the wrong game." Because Jasmine Carter wasn't just any woman. And this courtroom had just made its biggest mistake. The gavel slammed against the wooden bench with a force that echoed through the courtroom, a sound so final, so absolute, that it seemed to cut through the very air itself. The verdict had been read, and with it came a wave of satisfaction that rippled through those who had orchestrated this entire spectacle. Jasmine Carter stood at the center of it all, her wrists now bound by the cold metal of handcuffs, the weight of injustice pressing against her skin. She did not resist, did not beg, did not break down into the kind of despair that they were expecting. No, she stood firm, her posture unyielding, her gaze unwavering, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. They expected a fight. They expected desperation. They expected anger, tears, outrage, something, anything, that would show them they had won. But what they got instead was silence. A quiet, calculated kind of stillness. And that silence made them uneasy. Judge Harold Whitmore, a man who had long since abandoned the pretense of impartiality, leaned back in his chair, a smirk twitching at the corner of his lips. He had seen countless faces pass through his courtroom, had watched as men and women alike fell apart at his words, their fates sealed long before the first argument had even been made. But this woman did not behave like the others. There was no pleading, no denial, no outburst of anger. It was as if she was waiting. As if she knew something he didn't. And that thought, however fleeting, made something cold settle in his chest. He pushed it aside, clearing his throat, determined to re-establish the power he had so effortlessly wielded for years. "You should have walked away," Officer Raymond Cross murmured, his voice laced with amusement as he leaned in slightly, just enough so that only she could hear. "Could have saved yourself a lot of trouble. But no, you just had to keep digging, didn't you? You really thought you could go up against us? That you could take us down?" He laughed, low and quiet. "You must be one hell of an optimist." Jasmine remained expressionless, her breathing slow, measured. She had been in worse situations than this. She had stared down men far more dangerous than Cross. And the one thing she had learned in all her years of chasing criminals was that the ones who thought they had won were always the easiest to take down. Because arrogance made men blind. And Raymond Cross was nothing if not arrogant. Officer Brian Keller, standing just behind Cross, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't as smug, wasn't as sure as his partner. His eyes flickered between Jasmine and the judge, then to the jury, as if he was searching for some kind of confirmation that what they had just done was truly as final as they believed. Unlike Cross, he didn't revel in the corruption. He didn't thrive on the power. No, Keller was the kind of man who followed orders, who did what he was told because it was easier than questioning. But now something wasn't sitting right with him. Enough, the judge finally said, his voice cutting through the tension. I've heard all I need to hear. The law has spoken, and justice has been served. He smirked, as if the irony of his own words was a joke only he understood. You are hereby sentenced to. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, the sound barely noticeable beneath the low murmurs of the spectators. But Jasmine noticed. And so did Cross. A single figure stepped inside, their presence subtle yet deliberate. They didn't sit. They didn't move to blend in with the crowd. They simply stood, watching. Observing. Waiting. Cross's smirk faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. He turned his attention back to Jasmine, shaking his head. Guess this is the part where you start begging for a lighter sentence, huh? Maybe shed a few tears, make it look real pitiful. Jasmine's lips parted slightly, and for the first time since the trial began, she smiled. Not a wide grin, not an expression of forced bravado, but something small, something almost imperceptible. And yet, somehow, that slight shift in expression was enough to make the atmosphere in the room change. I don't beg, she said, her voice quiet, steady. The words made Keller shift again, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Cross, who was suddenly less amused than he had been moments before. There was something wrong. Something off. Keller had been in this job long enough to recognize when someone was holding back, when someone was playing a game that no one else had caught on to yet. And Jasmine, she wasn't scared. She wasn't even worried. The bailiff reached for her wrists, his grip firm as he guided her toward the exit that led to the holding cells. The air in the narrow hallway was thick, the scent of sweat and old paper lingering in the dim lighting. Cross followed close behind, his confidence slowly returning as he watched the door shut behind them. You really think you're something special, don't you? He mused, tilting his head as he studied her. Thought you could come into our house and expose us? Let me tell you something, Carter. You don't run this city. We do. You're just another fool who thought the rules didn't apply to her. And now? Now you're going to rot in a cell while we keep doing what we do best. Jasmine finally turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. And what is it you do best, Cross? Lie. Cover up your mistakes. Get rid of people who know too much. She let the word settle before adding, must be exhausting, living in constant fear of the truth. Cross's jaw twitched. Keller exhaled sharply through his nose, but he didn't say anything. Jasmine tilted her head, watching them both. You keep acting like you've won. Like this is over. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make them listen. But here's the thing about people like me, you never see us coming until it's too late. Cross opened his mouth, ready to throw another insult, ready to strip her of whatever sense of defiance she still had, but then, a phone rang. Not just any phone. His phone. Cross hesitated, then reached for it, his fingers moving a little too quickly as he pressed it to his ear. Yeah, what is it? His expression remained neutral at first. Then it shifted. The smirk faded. His brows furrowed. What do you mean, they know? Keller straightened. What's going on? Cross ignored him, turning away slightly, his voice lowering. That's impossible. We made sure, his hand clenched around the phone. Jasmine leaned back against the cold concrete wall, tilting her head, watching the unraveling unfold before her eyes. A second later, the door to the holding area swung open. But it wasn't a guard. It wasn't another officer coming to finalize her transport to a prison cell. It was the man from the courtroom. The man who had been standing there, watching, waiting. And when he spoke, his words shattered the illusion of control that Cross and Keller had so carefully built. The game had just changed. And Jasmine Carter was no longer the one on trial. The silence in the holding cell was suffocating, thick with a tension that no one dared to acknowledge. Cross was still holding his phone to his ear, his fingers gripping the device so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His face, which had been smug and satisfied just minutes ago, was now rigid with barely contained panic. Keller stood beside him, shifting uncomfortably, his unease growing with every second of silence that stretched between them. Jasmine Carter, still seated on the bench inside the cell, watched it all unfold with an expression that didn't belong to someone who had just been convicted. She didn't look defeated. She didn't look worried. If anything, she looked like someone who had just watched a plan slide perfectly into place. Cross finally spoke, his voice lower now, edged with something dangerous. "Repeat that." Another pause. Another tightening of his jaw. "That's not possible. We took care of it." He stopped mid-sentence, his breath hitching. Keller glanced at him, his brows furrowing. "What the hell is going on, Ray?" Cross didn't answer. His gaze slowly, reluctantly, shifted toward Jasmine. For the first time since this had started, his confidence wavered. His composure cracked. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. "What's wrong, Officer Cross? Bad news?" Cross ignored her, turning his back, lowering his voice as if that would somehow change the reality of what was happening. "I don't care how. Shut it down. Do you hear me? Shut it down." He ended the call with a sharp jab of his thumb, stuffing the phone back into his pocket. He took a slow breath, exhaling through his nose before turning back to Keller. "We have a problem." Keller crossed his arms. "Yeah, no shit. What kind of problem?" Cross hesitated for a second too long. Keller noticed. Jasmine noticed. Everyone in that room noticed. And then the door opened. The figure that stepped inside wasn't another officer. It wasn't a guard, or the warden, or someone here to finalize Jasmine's transport. No, this was someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Someone that Cross never expected to see again. Assistant Director Michael Hayes. FBI. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of men in dark suits entered the room, their movements precise, controlled. They weren't local police. They weren't part of the corrupt machinery that had built this farce of a trial. They were federal agents, and the way they carried themselves, the way they commanded the room without saying a word, made one thing immediately clear: they were here to clean up. Hayes's expression was unreadable, but his gaze was fixed directly on Cross, his dark eyes assessing, dissecting, already seeing through every lie that had been spun to put Jasmine in this cell. Keller took a step back, his spine straightening, his hands subtly flexing at his sides as if bracing for what was coming. Cross, however, didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't even breathe for a moment. Hayes took another step forward, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but there was nothing gentle about it. "Raymond Cross. Brian Keller. By the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you are both under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and falsifying evidence in a federal case." The room went completely still. Cross's face twisted in disbelief, but Keller froze. His entire body tensed, his mouth opening slightly as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. His breathing had gone shallow, his pulse visibly pounding at the base of his throat. Jasmine smiled. And then, all hell broke loose. Cross took a step forward, his voice sharp with fury. "You can't do this. You don't have any jurisdiction here. This is a local case." "Not anymore," Hayes cut in smoothly. "See, here's the thing. You should have been smarter." Should've covered your tracks better. But you got sloppy. You got arrogant. You thought you had control of the narrative, that you could make this all disappear. But you didn't count on one thing. He turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward Jasmine. You didn't count on her. Keller swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. His hands twitched at his sides, a nervous habit that betrayed the absolute panic settling in his gut. This is a mistake, he blurted, his voice lacking the usual confidence. Whatever you think you have, we have enough to bury you, Hayes interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. You fabricated evidence. You tampered with a federal investigation. You took bribes to manipulate a case. You think this is about one wrongful conviction? No. This is about a system-wide operation of corruption, abuse, and misconduct that you and your buddies have been running for years. Cross's jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed at his temple. This is bullshit. Hayes tilted his head slightly. Is it? He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small, black recording device. With a single press of a button, a familiar voice crackled to life. She's a problem. We need to get rid of her. Cross's own voice. Keller's face drained of color. Jasmine sat back, crossing her legs as the recording continued. The judge is already on board. We'll plant what we need, get her convicted, and move on. By the time anyone figures it out, it won't matter. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Cross's fingers curled into fists. His breathing had turned sharp, erratic. You set me up. Jasmine shrugged. No, Ray. You set yourself up. I just made sure the right people were listening. The reality hit like a freight train. She had never been the one on trial. They had. And now, the noose they had so carefully crafted for her was closing around their necks instead. Hayes stepped forward, gesturing toward the federal agents behind him. Take them into custody. Cross lunged. A last, desperate attempt to escape. A final, reckless bid for control. But it was too late. The agents moved swiftly, expertly, subduing him before he even got within a foot of Jasmine. He fought, but it was useless. Keller didn't even try to resist. He just stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, his breath coming in short, broken gasps. Jasmine rose from the bench, her hands still cuffed, and took a slow step toward Cross as he was shoved against the wall, his hands now being restrained with the same metal he had placed on her wrists. You were right about one thing, she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. This is your world. A world built on lies, on power plays, on men like you deciding who wins and who loses. She leaned in slightly. But you forgot one very important rule about power, Ray. He gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with hatred. What? Jasmine smiled, her voice a whisper. It always shifts. And with that, the agents dragged them away. Game over. The hallway outside the holding cells was chaos. Officers who had once stood with an air of invincibility now whispered among themselves, their faces tight with unease. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, believing that the system would always protect them, believing that they were the ones who dictated the rules. And now, in an instant, the floor beneath them had cracked, their illusions shattering into something cold, something real. Cross struggled against the federal agents gripping his arms, his body thrashing as they dragged him toward the exit. His voice, usually so composed, so full of arrogant authority, had been reduced to pure, unfiltered rage. You think this is over? You think you've won? His breathing was uneven, his face flushed with fury. You have no idea who you're messing with. You hear me, Carter? This doesn't end here. Jasmine stood just a few feet away, her gaze locked onto him, her expression unreadable. Cross had always prided himself on reading people, on knowing their weaknesses, but right now, he couldn't read her at all. And that terrified him. Keller was a different story. He had stopped fighting the moment the cuffs locked around his wrists. His face had gone pale, his hands trembling, his entire body slumped in defeat. He wasn't like Cross. He wasn't built for this kind of downfall. He had spent his entire career riding the wave of corruption, but he had never thought he'd actually drown in it. Hayes remained impassive, watching as his agents moved swiftly, efficiently. Take them out of here. I don't want them speaking to anyone until they've been processed. Every conversation is to be documented. Every word recorded. His voice was smooth, but there was a finality in it that left no room for argument. Cross let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You really think you've changed anything? You really think locking us up is gonna fix what's broken? His eyes burned with hatred as they found Jasmine again. There'll be another me. Another Keller. Another Whitmore. You think this is justice? It's a joke. Jasmine took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the floor, her movements unhurried, measured. She let the silence stretch before she spoke, before she let him feel it. You're right, she said finally, her voice calm. The system is still broken. And there will be more like you. But you want to know the difference between then and now? She tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp, cutting straight through him. Now, we know exactly how to find them. How to expose them. And we'll be watching. Cross clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching behind his back. There was nothing left for him to say. Nothing he could say. The world that had once been his was crumbling beneath his feet, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Keller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter, almost desperate. Jasmine. The sound of her name coming from his mouth nearly made her laugh. He hadn't called her that in all the years they had known each other. It had always been Carter. Always cold. Always distant. She didn't blink. What? He hesitated, licking his lips like he was searching for the right words, like there was still something he could say to fix this, to undo what had already been set in motion. You don't have to do this. You don't have to, Jasmine cut him off before he could finish. I don't have to. She let out a short, humorless laugh. You framed me. You tried to bury me. And now that you're the one in cuffs, you don't like how it feels. She stepped closer, just enough so that he had no choice but to see her, to really see her. Where was that mercy when it was me in that courtroom? When I was the one being dragged away for something I didn't do? Keller exhaled shakily, his entire body rigid. He wanted to defend himself. Wanted to explain. But the truth was, there was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. Jasmine tilted her head, studying him for a long moment before she spoke again, her voice quieter now, but no less sharp. You chose your side a long time ago, Keller. And now, you get to live with that choice. He said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Cross, still defiant, let out another bitter chuckle as he was shoved forward, the agents leading them toward the exit. Enjoy your little victory, Carter. But you better watch your back. The next one won't be so easy. Jasmine didn't respond. She just watched as they were led away, their figures disappearing down the hall, their footsteps growing fainter until, finally, they were gone. For the first time since this nightmare had started, Jasmine breathed. It wasn't relief, not exactly. Because she knew this wasn't the end. She knew there was still work to do. That there were still more men like Cross, like Keller, like Whitmore. But today, they had won. Hayes stepped beside her, exhaling slowly. You did good, Carter. Jasmine glanced at him, the weight of everything finally settling into her bones. Did I? Hayes didn't answer right away. He looked down the hall where the agents had taken Cross and Keller, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. It's a start. Jasmine nodded, but her hands were still curled into fists at her sides. The anger was still there, the fire that had kept her fighting for so long still burning hot inside her chest. It's never gonna be enough, is it? Hayes let out a tired sigh. No. But it's a damn good first step. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the empty hallway, knowing that even though this battle was over, the war was far from won. But for the first time in a long time, she knew she wasn't fighting it alone. The corridors of the courthouse felt different now. The air, once thick with the arrogance of those who had believed themselves untouchable, had shifted into something else. A slow, creeping realization was settling into the walls, into the lingering whispers of officers and clerks who had spent years looking the other way. The ones who had thought they were safe. The ones who had convinced themselves that power like Cross's, like Whitmore's, would always protect them. But now, that illusion had shattered, and in its place was a suffocating uncertainty. The balance had shifted. And they all felt it. Jasmine Carter stood in the same hallway she had walked through hours ago, but now, everything was different. She was no longer the one in cuffs. No longer the one waiting to be sentenced. No longer the one being dragged toward a fate she had no control over. She had turned the tables. But even as she stood there, the weight of victory pressing against her chest, she didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because the truth was, this wasn't over. Not really. Hayes stood beside her, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the doors that Cross and Keller had just been escorted through. The man had seen more corruption in his lifetime than most people could fathom, had spent decades wading through the filth of the system, trying to clean up what felt like an endless mess. And even now, even after this, there was no satisfaction in his expression. No celebration. Because he knew what Jasmine knew. This won't be enough, she murmured, her voice quiet but firm. Hayes didn't look at her right away. He inhaled slowly, let the breath settle in his lungs before exhaling just as steadily. It never is. Jasmine's hands curled into fists at her sides, the fire inside her refusing to die down. They'll find another judge. Another set of officers willing to do the same thing. Another way to twist the system in their favor. She shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice. What happens then? Another Cross. Another Keller. Another case like mine, except next time, maybe they don't make mistakes. Maybe they don't get caught. Hayes finally turned to her, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then we catch them. Just like we caught these two. Jasmine let out a dry, humorless laugh. And what about the ones we don't catch? How many more people have to go through what I just went through before something actually changes? Silence stretched between them. It was the question that had no answer. The truth that neither of them could deny. This wasn't justice. This was just damage control. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and Jasmine turned just in time to see someone approaching. A man in a suit, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. She recognized him immediately. Assistant DA Marcus Holloway. The one prosecutor in this courthouse who had actually tried, to fight against the corruption that had been suffocating the system from the inside out. But even he had his limits. Even he had to choose his battles carefully. He stopped in front of them, his gaze flicking between Hayes and Jasmine, his jaw set with something that looked a lot like resignation. We need to talk. Jasmine crossed her arms. About what? Marcus exhaled through his nose, glancing over his shoulder, making sure they were alone before speaking. About what happens next. Jasmine narrowed her eyes slightly. What do you mean? We already have the evidence. We have the recordings, the testimonies, the charges against Cross and Keller. You have them, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper than before. But what about Whitmore? Jasmine stilled. A flicker of something dark passed through Hayes's expression. What about him? Marcus hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line before he finally answered. He's still on the bench. Jasmine's stomach twisted. Of course he was. Judge Harold Whitmore, the man who had orchestrated this entire trial. The man who had taken bribes, who had handed out guilty verdicts like they were favors, who had allowed Cross and Keller to do whatever they wanted as long as they made sure the right people stayed in power, he was still sitting on his damn throne. Jasmine's fingers twitched. How? Marcus's gaze hardened. Because men like him don't fall that easily. Because even now, even after everything, there are still people willing to protect him. People who will do whatever it takes to keep him exactly where he is. Jasmine shook her head. That's not possible. We have enough evidence to. No, Marcus cut in. You have enough to bury Cross and Keller. Maybe a few others. But Whitmore? He let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple as if the weight of this conversation was physically exhausting. He's too careful. The money, the deals, the favors, it's all buried. There's nothing directly tying him to what happened today. And without that, we can't touch him. Jasmine felt her jaw tighten, the anger inside her building again, surging through her veins like fire. Whitmore had set this up. He had played God with her life. And now, after everything, he was just going to walk away. She took a slow, measured breath. So, what? He just gets to stay in that courtroom. Keep doing what he's been doing. Keep destroying lives while we all sit back and let him. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. Jasmine took a step closer to him, her voice lower now, colder. There's always something. Always a weak spot. Marcus met her gaze, something flickering in his expression. He studied her, as if debating something, before finally sighing. If there is, we haven't found it yet. And until we do, he stays exactly where he is. Jasmine's pulse pounded against her skull, a storm raging inside her. She wanted to fight. To burn the whole system down if that's what it took. But she knew the truth. Whitmore wasn't like Cross. He wasn't like Keller. He was bigger, smarter, deeper in the game than either of them had ever been. If they were going to take him down, it couldn't be rushed. It had to be perfect. She turned to Hayes. You knew this would happen, didn't you? Hayes didn't blink. I suspected. Jasmine exhaled sharply. And what? We just let him walk. Hayes's voice was firm. For now. The words hit like a slap. She hated it. Hated knowing that Whitmore was still out there, still sitting behind that bench, still holding the power that he never deserved. But she also knew something else. Something far more important. Whitmore thought he was safe. Thought he had dodged the bullet. Thought that because he had avoided the fallout this time, he was in the clear. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And the next time she walked into his courtroom, it wouldn't be as the accused. It would be as the one bringing him down. Jasmine stood in the courthouse parking lot, the night air wrapping around her like a heavy cloak, thick with the weight of unfinished business. The flashing red and blue lights of federal vehicles illuminated the pavement, casting long shadows of agents moving in and out of the building, carrying evidence, closing out what had just unfolded. The world outside still moved like nothing had changed, but inside these walls, inside this case, everything was different now. And yet, it still wasn't enough. The fire inside her hadn't burned out, it had only shifted, become something sharper, something colder. Cross and Keller were done, but the man who had orchestrated it all, who had sat behind that bench with the confidence of a king on his throne, was still exactly where he wanted to be. Marcus stood beside her, hands shoved into his pockets, his face lined with exhaustion. His suit, once crisp and polished, was now wrinkled from the hours spent fighting a system that had no intention of changing. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You should go home, Carter. Get some rest. Jasmine let out a short, humorless laugh, her arms crossing over her chest. You think I can just turn it off? Just walk away like none of this ever happened? She turned to him, her eyes sharp, unyielding. Whitmore's still out there. He's still on that bench, still deciding who wins and who loses, still running his operation like nothing happened. And you're telling me to go home? Marcus held her gaze, his own expression carefully measured. I'm telling you that if you burn yourself out before the fight even begins, you're no good to anyone. Jasmine exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down her face. She hated that he was right. Hated that this wasn't a battle she could win in a single night, that patience was required when every part of her wanted to act now. And what happens in the meantime? What happens to the people that end up in his courtroom tomorrow? Next week? Next month? Marcus ran a hand over his head, his jaw tightening. We do what we can. We take what we have and we build something solid. Whitmore's careful, but he's not perfect. He slipped up once by trusting Cross and Keller, and he will slip up again. But we need more. We need something that can't be ignored, something even his friends in high places can't bury. Jasmine took a step closer, her voice lower now, her frustration breaking through the thin veneer of calm she was trying to maintain. And what if that takes too long? What if more innocent people get swallowed by this system before we get enough? Marcus hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. And it was the same answer Jasmine already had. It was the truth they both hated, the reality they had both been forced to accept time and time again. Then they do, he admitted finally, his voice tight. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it. Jasmine clenched her jaw, her fists tightening at her sides. The injustice of it all, the sheer weight of it, felt unbearable. How many times had she seen it happen? How many times had she watched the guilty walk free while the innocent were thrown away like they didn't matter? How many times had she seen people like Whitmore thrive because the system had designed itself to protect them? She turned away from Marcus, staring out at the city lights in the distance, her pulse pounding against her skull. That's not good enough, she murmured. Marcus let out a slow sigh. It never is. A new voice cut through the tension, low and steady. You're not gonna let this go, are you? Jasmine turned to find Hayes approaching, his face unreadable. The man had spent years navigating the corridors of power, maneuvering through the filth of corruption while trying to clean it up. He knew better than anyone how slow and frustrating the process could be, how much waiting was required to take down men like Whitmore. And yet, when he looked at Jasmine now, there was something in his expression that almost looked like approval. Jasmine met his gaze, unflinching. Would you? Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line, but there was no reprimand, no dismissal. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Good. Marcus frowned, his eyes flicking between them. What the hell does that mean? Hayes slid his hands into his pockets, his stance casual but his words anything but. It means we don't wait. Not entirely. He turned his attention fully to Jasmine now, his gaze sharper. You said it yourself, Whitmore's not invincible. No one is. And if he's still in that chair, still making calls, still pulling strings, then we make sure every damn move he makes is watched. Jasmine's heartbeat quickened, her mind already racing ahead, already seeing the pieces rearrange themselves on the board. Surveillance. Hayes nodded. We build a case, one he can't talk his way out of. Every deal, every favor, every connection he thinks is buried, we unbury it. We make sure that by the time we're done, not even his most powerful friends can save him. Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temples. Jesus Christ, do you have any idea how long that could take? Jasmine turned to him, her eyes steady, unwavering. However long it takes, it's worth it. Hayes smirked slightly, shaking his head. Damn right it is. Marcus groaned, tilting his head back toward the sky as if asking the universe why he surrounded himself with people like this. "I hate both of you." Jasmine couldn't help it, she laughed. It wasn't light-hearted, wasn't free, but it was real. And in that moment, standing under the glow of courthouse lights, surrounded by the remnants of a battle they had won but hadn't finished, she realized something. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. For years, she had carried the weight of justice on her own, convinced that if she didn't do it, no one else would. But now, she had allies. People who saw what she saw, who felt what she felt, who were willing to keep pushing even when the system tried to push back. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt something dangerously close to hope. She turned back toward the courthouse one last time, staring at the doors that led to the world Whitmore still controlled. He thought he had survived this. Thought he had escaped the fallout. He was wrong. Because Jasmine Carter wasn't just going to expose him. She was going to destroy him. The morning was still settling into the city, the sun barely rising over the horizon, casting a dull golden hue against the glass skyscrapers that towered over the streets. The world outside moved in its usual rhythm, cars honking impatiently, pedestrians weaving through the sidewalks, their heads buried in their phones, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the lingering staleness of exhaust fumes. It was a world that never stopped, never paused to acknowledge the battles being fought behind closed doors, never cared about the wars waged in courtrooms, in police departments, in backroom deals where justice was little more than a bargaining chip. And yet, in the midst of it all, there were places, small and unassuming, where the undercurrent of power struggles could be felt if one knew where to look. Jasmine Carter knew exactly where to look. The cafe was tucked between two gray office buildings, nondescript, quiet, the kind of place where people passed through on their way to more important destinations. The kind of place where no one would pay attention to three people sitting in the back corner, speaking in low voices over cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. Jasmine stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around her like a thin layer of comfort, the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon weaving into the air, creating an illusion of normalcy. But this was not a normal morning. This was a meeting, the kind that changed everything, the kind that determined whether a battle ended or if it escalated into something far bigger than anticipated. She spotted Hayes first. He was seated near the back, posture relaxed, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, scanning the room out of habit, out of instinct, out of years of experience navigating a world filled with people who lied for a living. Marcus was already there too, his fingers absent-mindedly stirring the coffee in front of him, though it was clear he had no intention of drinking it. His expression was lined with exhaustion, with frustration, with the weight of knowing exactly how tangled the system was, how deep corruption ran, how even when you won, the war never really ended. Jasmine didn't hesitate as she made her way to their table, sliding into the seat across from them, setting her phone on the surface face down, a silent signal that this conversation wasn't one to be interrupted. This wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what was going to happen next. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples before finally speaking. "Tell me you've reconsidered." His voice was flat, but there was something beneath it, something almost pleading. Jasmine arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. "Reconsidered what?" Marcus let out a breath that was somewhere between frustration and exhaustion. "This. All of this. The surveillance. The digging. The fact that you're about to go after a federal judge who still has the system backing him." His fingers tapped against the ceramic of his coffee cup, restless, agitated. "This is different from Cross and Keller. Those two. They were disposable. Whitmore. He's got people behind him, powerful people, and they're not just gonna let him fall. You know that, right?" Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her expression calm, but her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Are you scared?" Marcus scoffed, shaking his head. "Of course I'm scared. You should be too. Because if you don't think Whitmore already knows that you're coming for him, then you're not as smart as I thought you were." Hayes, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, his tone measured, almost amused. "We don't do things halfway, Holloway. You know that." Marcus let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he glanced at Hayes. "You're enjoying this way too much." Jasmine, however, wasn't laughing. She wasn't smiling. She was focused, her mind already 3 steps ahead, already planning, already anticipating every possible move Whitmore could make. "Whitmore made a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "He underestimated me. He thought that by letting Cross and Keller take the fall, he'd be safe, that he'd wash his hands clean and keep his seat. But what he doesn't know, what he never even considered, is that we're already ahead of him." Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Jasmine reached into her bag, pulling out a slim file, the edges worn from being handled too many times. She placed it on the table, sliding it toward Marcus, watching as his fingers hovered over it for a moment before finally picking it up. His eyes moved across the pages, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something much darker. Then he stopped. His fingers curled slightly around the paper. His voice was lower now, almost cautious. "You've got to be kidding me." Jasmine shook her head. "That's just the beginning." Marcus let out a slow breath, setting the file down carefully, as if it might explode if he wasn't careful. "You've been holding on to this the entire time." Hayes smirked slightly, finally taking a sip of his coffee. "She's thorough." Marcus rubbed his face, exhaling through his nose. "This is more than enough to put pressure on him. If we leak this in the right places, get the right people talking, he won't just be fighting a legal battle, he'll be fighting for his career." Jasmine nodded. "And when powerful men start scrambling, they make mistakes." Marcus shook his head. "And when they make mistakes, people get hurt. Are you ready for that?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I've been ready." Marcus studied her for a long moment, as if trying to find a crack, something that would tell him she wasn't as determined as she seemed. But there was nothing. Nothing but certainty. Finally, he sighed, leaning back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "You really don't stop, do you?" Jasmine picked up her coffee, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic. "Not when I know I'm right." Hayes smirked slightly, nudging Marcus's arm. "Come on. Admit it. You're impressed." Marcus rolled his eyes, letting out a breath of exasperation. "I hate both of you." Jasmine allowed herself the faintest of smiles, the first one in days. "You'll get used to it." Marcus exhaled, looking at the file again, his fingers drumming against the cover. He knew what this meant. He knew what they were about to do. He knew that once they took this step, there was no turning back. But he also knew something else. Whitmore had spent years playing this game, maneuvering through the system like a king who never had to fear losing his throne. But he had never played against someone like Jasmine Carter. And for the first time, Marcus actually believed they could win. He tapped the file once, his voice quieter now, but firm. "All right. Let's do this." And just like that, the war against Whitmore had officially begun. The storm broke 3 weeks later, in the very same courthouse where Jasmine had once stood, wrists bound, accused of crimes she never committed. But this time, she wasn't the one on trial. This time, the weight of justice wasn't pressing down on her shoulders. It was pressing down on Judge Harold Whitmore. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every corridor outside brimming with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public who had followed the case since the scandal had erupted. The fall of Raymond Cross and Brian Keller had been the first domino, but the real earthquake came when Whitmore's connections began unraveling. One by one, his allies, the businessmen who had funded his rulings, the officers who had benefited from his selective sentencing, the politicians who had used him to push their agendas, started jumping ship. Some turned against him to save themselves. Others simply disappeared, cutting ties before his name could drag theirs down too. Jasmine sat in the front row, her expression calm, controlled, but inside, she could feel the electricity of this moment humming beneath her skin. She had spent years watching men like Whitmore walk away unscathed, bending the law to serve themselves, turning justice into something bought and sold. But not this time. This time, the evidence was ironclad. The surveillance, the financial records, the testimonies from those he had once controlled, it was all laid out in front of the jury like a roadmap of his corruption. There was no escape. The judge sitting in Whitmore's place cleared his throat, shifting in his chair before reading the verdict. The room was so silent that even the faintest breath felt deafening. Whitmore sat stiffly, his jaw locked, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He had spent decades dictating the fate of others, deciding who would walk free and who would rot in prison. Now, for the first time in his life, someone else was deciding his. Guilty on all counts. The words rang through the room like a gunshot. For the briefest second, Whitmore didn't move. He didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Then, slowly, his body sank into his chair, his posture collapsing under the weight of his own downfall. The mighty judge, the man who had once controlled this very courtroom, was now nothing more than a disgraced felon awaiting sentencing. The sound of the gavel striking would sealed his fate. Jasmine didn't react. Didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled, the breath leaving her chest like a weight she had carried for too long. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been about revenge. This was about something bigger. About proving that no one, not even a man who had built his power on the backs of the powerless, was untouchable. Marcus let out a slow, measured breath beside her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Holy shit," he muttered under his breath. "I can't believe we actually pulled it off." Jasmine's voice was quiet but firm. "Believe it." Hayes, who had been standing near the back of the courtroom, his arms folded, simply nodded, his expression unreadable but pleased. He had seen battles like this before, had fought them himself, but even he knew this one was different. This one mattered. As Whitmore was led away in cuffs, the cameras flashing like a relentless storm, Jasmine finally allowed herself to feel it. Not just satisfaction. Not just relief. But certainty. The kind that came with knowing she had done the right thing, that she had fought for something real. Cross and Keller had already been sentenced, a decade each, stripped of their badges, their names forever stained by the truth. The system they had manipulated for so long had finally turned against them, and they had no one left to save them. And Whitmore? He would spend the rest of his life fighting the very system he once controlled. But Jasmine's fight wasn't over. Not completely. Because men like Whitmore were just one part of the problem. There would always be another. Another corrupt official, another cop who thought he was above the law, another system rigged against the people it was supposed to protect. Marcus leaned toward her slightly, lowering his voice as the courtroom buzzed around them. "So, what now?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "We keep going." He let out a dry chuckle. "You never stop, do you?" Jasmine finally allowed a small, knowing smile. "No. And neither should you." Hayes stepped closer, his voice calm, but there was a quiet respect in it. "I meant what I said before, Carter. You did good. And if you ever decide the Bureau is where you want to be again, you know my door is open." Jasmine glanced at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "I appreciate that. But I think I've got my own fight to handle." Hayes nodded, not surprised in the slightest. "Then do me a favor. Don't burn the whole system down before we get a chance to fix it." Jasmine let out a breath, looking around the courtroom one last time. She knew this wasn't the end of the war. But it was one hell of a victory. And that was enough. For now. Powerful people only fall when enough light is shined on the shadows they hide in. This story wasn't just about one case, one courtroom, or one corrupt judge. It was about something bigger. About a system that has, for too long, been built to protect the powerful while punishing the powerless. But the truth? The truth is always there, waiting to be found, waiting to be exposed. And when the right person refuses to back down, refuses to be silenced, refuses to play by the rules that were never meant to be fair, everything changes. Jasmine Carter was never supposed to win. The system wasn't designed for people like her to come out on top. But she did. Because she made the rules bend. Because she refused to stop. And in the end, she didn't just clear her own name, she took down the very people who thought they could erase her. But the question remains, how many more Whitmores are still out there? How many more trials are rigged before they even begin? How many more innocent people are forced to fight battles they should never have had to fight? And more importantly, who will be the next Jasmine Carter? Justice isn't something that happens on its own. It's something that has to be fought for. So tell me, if you saw something wrong, if you knew the truth, would you fight for it? Would you risk everything to expose it? Or would you stay silent, let it pass, hope that someone else would handle it? Because if Jasmine Carter's story teaches us anything, it's that justice only happens when someone refuses to let go of the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that someone could be you. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more thrilling narratives filled with justice, redemption, and the kind of twists you never see coming. Justice may be unpredictable, but one thing is certain, we're just getting started.